The reason I started looking into William Colvill was because I had to do a project to complete my master's degree at the university a few years ago, and so what I ended up with was this, about 110,000 words about William Colvill. And I'm just going to give you a little teaser before we get going here. He did have some notoriety after the Civil War. He was elected to the legislature a couple times. He was Attorney General of Minnesota. He did his moment of glory, of course, was when he led the group of First Minnesotans down the hill at Gettysburg, Cemetery Ridge. And then the little teaser is he almost missed that battle. So we'll get to that in just a minute or so. He was born in western New York, a little town called Forestville. He went to schools there. He went up the road to Fredonia, to the Fredonia Academy, and then he decided, he taught for a year, and then he decided he wanted to become a lawyer. So he went to Buffalo, and he got accepted into a law firm. Buffalo is just about 45 miles from Forestville, and the law firm he got accepted into is the law firm of Millard Fillmore, who at that time was the Vice President of the United States. And so he stayed there for a couple of years. That's how you became a lawyer in those days. You studied under other lawyers, and he got he passed the bar in 1851. By this time, Fillmore was President of the United States, so it must have been kind of heady stuff to be studying in that particular law firm. He went back to Forestville, practiced for a couple of years, and then, like so many young people in that time, he went west to make his fortune. This is Red Wing in 1874, which is exactly 20 years after Colvill got there, but it gives you an idea of kind of what the town looked like, and it's a typical river town, and at that time, one of the larger towns in Minnesota. He split his time between Red Wing and St. Paul. When he was in St. Paul, he was the enrolling clerk, and then later the secretary of the Territorial Council, which says something else about those days and how fast you could move up the ladder. He just got off the boat, and now he's secretary of the Territorial Council, which was preceded the state legislature. He had a bunch of jobs in Red Wing. He was a notary public, district clerk of district court, but mainly did land speculation. They had signed some major treaties in 1851 in Minnesota, and they opened up 21 million acres in Minnesota. So land speculation was a big deal. The only thing I can equate it to is stock speculation in the 1920s, and everybody was in it. Everybody was dabbling in it. People were plotting out towns where there were no towns, and things like that. So he also decided to get into a newspaper, and he became eventually the editor and publisher of the Red Wing Sentinel, and it was a Democratic newspaper in those days. All the newspapers were affiliated with one party or another, and so he happened to be a Democrat. His father was a Democrat. He was a Democrat. The Democrats, unfortunately, in those days were having a lot of trouble. The major force of the party was in the southern states. They were not happy, and they said if Lincoln gets elected, we'll secede. So the Democratic Party was precarious in those days. Even in Minnesota, it was split almost down the middle between what they called free soilers and the other wing, so finally in 1860, Colvill just wrote a note in his newspaper. He said, "I'm done. I'm out of here. I can't take it anymore, and my party is going to heck." And so he quit. He quit being a newspaper guy. that was kind of, because he was a newspaper guy, that's what drove me to doing this paper, because I wondered how a newspaper guy could become a war hero. You know, that was amazing to me. But so anyway, in April 19th, 1861, there was a big rally, I guess you'd call it, in Red Wing and in all Minnesota towns. The South was seceding from the Union. Lincoln had been elected. They gathered at the courthouse. There were bands playing and flags flying, and excuse me. And it was Colvill himself gave a speech that night, and he other people gave speeches. And at the end of all the speeches, the Judge Welch, who was running the meeting, put a roll of paper out on the dais, and he said, "Okay, who wants to sign up?" And so all the young guys were moving their way towards the front of the room, except for Colvill and the judge's son, Ed Welch, was one of Colvill's friends. They actually ran over the tops of the chairs to get to the front because they wanted to be the first. And Welch, I think, was, Colvill was this massive guy. You'll see some pictures of him in a minute. So I think Welch kind of got there first, but just as he got to it, he slipped and fell, and he reached up to grab the pen, and Colvill grabbed it and said, "You're next, Ed." And he signed his name, and so he was the first one to enroll in the Red Wing company that later became Company F in the First Minnesota Regiment, which is, of course, one of the more famous regiments in the war. This is my map of Bull Run. I'm just going to tell you a couple of things about Bull Run. It was the first battle of the war, of course, and neither side was very well prepared. Colvill was leading his company. They were on the far, on the side of I can't see the slide, so I can't tell you exactly where it is, but he was way over to the side with his company near the woods. They fought all day long. They were guarding some cannon. The cannon were taken and retaken 3 different times during the day. It was a interesting battle. And so now the battle's over, and the Confederates had brought up a lot of reinforcements. The Union was losing. They were retreating. Colvill found himself going down the road. He came around a corner, and here's a whole company of Confederate guys with their rifles, and they started shooting at him. And he said, this is a quote from one of the accounts that he wrote, "You should have seen me with a Secesh smoothbore on my shoulder and a large artillery sword in my hand, making my long shank spin." And he actually did get away, and he got a little further down the road, and he got so far down the road he ran into General McDowell, the Union commander at Bull Run. And McDowell was, of course, giving orders and telling people what to do. And as Colvill went by, he said, "You ought to rally the men in the woods, General," meaning you better hide these guys because and so I just want to point out, a couple of things. Is he had been fighting all day, and when he finally retreated, he had a Confederate rifle and a Confederate artillery sword. He had his souvenirs with him. And then when he finally got far enough down the road, he managed to insult the commanding general that day. So it gives you a little sense of his character. He was an interesting guy. It's just some artwork of what he looked like. One of his officers wrote about him when they're on the Peninsular Campaign. "The captain is this incomprehensible mixture of sense and nonsense, goodness and evil, precaution and carelessness, dirt and cleanliness, life and laziness, as human eyes ever contemplated." On June 31st, on the Peninsular Campaign, the Civil War buffs, of course, know about, they had driven all the way up the peninsula. They were close to Richmond. Lee took over the Confederate forces. back down they came. And so when they're in retreat, Colvill on June 31st, 62, he was, took a bullet right here, 2 inches above his heart. And they hustled him away and took him to an aid station, and the doctor came over and took off his shirt and looked at it and said, "That's a very dangerous wound, don't move." And so he sat there for hours, waiting for the doctor to come back. The doctor was busy, of course. There's a lot to do, and so he, doctor finally came back and said, "I'm sorry, Colonel, or Captain at this time, I'm going to have to leave you behind. We're moving everybody back, and we have no way to transport you." And Colvill stood up and said, "I will not be left behind." So at this time, they brought this guy, one of the other officers in the First Minnesota, had a horse there that he was riding, and he offered it to Colvill, and Colvill said, "No, I won't ride your horse," he said, but just let me trail along behind. So he grabbed the horse's tail and used it as support and walked 15 miles to the evacuation point. He spent 2 months in a Baltimore hospital, went back home to Forestville, and then rejoined his unit. He was promoted to major in late 1862, then to lieutenant colonel, second in command of the First Minnesota. And then on June 11th, he was the guy who was in command got sick, went home, and Colvill took over. And so he was all of a sudden in command of a regiment, a very proud regiment, 3 weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. John Quinn Imholt, who's a historian, wrote some years ago about Colvill. He said at this point where he took over command, "Colvill was liked by the men, although they considered him to be without military skill. His bravery was apparent to all, but his demeanor was immature. Yet within 2 months he would acquire a military reputation unrivaled by any Minnesotan before or since." So we'll get into this is what Colvill looked like in uniform. We'll get into Gettysburg. Again, the Civil War people here, that's probably why you're here tonight, know about that battle. Lee had invaded the North and gone into Pennsylvania. He was going to feed his troops off the Union land and not off his own land for a while, and probably was looking for a fight. And in the meantime, the American, the Union was wheeling around and keeping the army between Lee and Washington. And first it was Hooker, and then it was Meade, and it all kind of came together at this little town called Gettysburg. On the 25th of June, Colvill was riding a horse in front of his guys, and the artillery shell came down and killed his horse and threw Colvill into the mud. And so he got up, scraped himself off, and picked up his saddlebag and just kept right on marching with the guys. And they eventually got him another horse. But this is now I'm up to the little teaser I was talking about. On June 29th, they came to the Monocacy River, and it was very hot afternoon. They had marched already about 15 miles that day, and they had the Second Corps adjutant general standing there, and his job, he's a mean, this guy was picked probably because he was a mean guy, and his job was to make sure that the troops that were moving along marched through the river and didn't use this little makeshift footbridge that was off to the side, because it would slow things down. It's his job to keep the troops moving. Well, the troops weren't too happy about this. You get your boots wet when it's 90 degrees or 100 degrees outside, and it's just not very pleasant. And so they were very unhappy with this, but Colvill marched them right through the river. But some of the officers went over and used the footbridge, and this didn't make this adjutant general guy very happy. So And it probably would have all blown over. He and Colvill had a little exchange, and it probably would have been all blown over, but they were about 3 more miles up the road, and here comes this general staff officer, and as he went through, it said the men hissed and groaned, and I suppose groaning is like, and they denied it. The First Minnesota denied it and said it was the 15th Massachusetts, but the officer came over to Colvill and said, "Consider yourself under arrest." So he stayed under arrest for the next 3 days, and now it's July 2nd, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and the First Minnesota is on top of the Cemetery Ridge, right, kind of in the middle of the ridge, and then later they moved them over a little bit to the left. They were guarding a battery of cannon, and they watched, this terrible battle go on all day long below them. They could see the smoke and hear the noise of it, and right around sunset, this little group of Minnesotans, there are only 262 of them left by this time. So a couple of companies have been detached, but the war and the sickness and disease, mainly sickness, and that's what took them out. So they're down to 262 guys waiting there, and pretty soon there's virtually thousands of Union soldiers retreating through their position, and retreating, not in good order. And Colvill tried to, stop, fight, but they were on their way. And so, but the First Minnesota stayed its ground. General Hancock, they call him Hancock the Superb. He was actually the general who had placed the troops on the high ground that day, and so should get credit for that. And he came up and he looked at this little group of Minnesotans and looked down the hill, and there's about 1,600 troops from Alabama coming up the hill in 3 lines. And he looked down and he said, "My God, is this all the troops that we've got here?" And then he said to Colvill, "What unit is this?" And Colvill said, "First Minnesota, sir." And Hancock said, "Do you see those colors down there?" Colvill said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Take them." And these guys had been in war for 2 years. They knew, they weren't new guys to war. They knew what they were being asked to do. It was a suicide mission. And it was just to buy a couple of minutes of time so that the Union could bring up reinforcements. Because if those Alabamans made it to the top of the hill, that was right the center of the Union position. And the whole battle would have swung right there. So Colvill led his troops down the hill at the double quick, bayonets glinting in the sunset, and they encountered the Alabamans at the bottom of the hill. There's a Plum Run runs through there. It's a dry creek bed. The Alabamans were a little disorganized because they were making their way over this creek bed right when the Minnesotans hit them. Colvill ordered the men to fire when they were 15 feet away from the Confederate troops. So you can imagine what, even it's a small group, but 262 guys firing their rifles 15 feet away from you will probably cause you to step back. And so, they accomplished what they had set out to do. They stopped the Confederates from coming up the ridge. But at a cost that was, just so terrible. Only 47 men went back up the hill. Colvill was hit the first time at right at Plum Run. He was standing right over it and directing his troops, and he was hit. I don't know if any of you have seen a mini ball. Here, I'll flip this. This is the charge. I'm not sure where that picture comes from. The mini ball went through his arm, went under his shoulder blade, hit him in the backbone, and then lodged in the other side of his back. It said it spun me around and made me see stars. And one of his officers came up and said, "Colonel, you're hit." And he said, "I don't know." He said, "Take care of the men." And then right then he was hit for the second time. This one hit him in the right ankle, right where all the bones come together, and just shattered every bone in his ankle. And down he went. And luckily, he happened to fall right into the dry creek bed. And he said for the next till he passed out. He said it was just, he just kept hearing these bullets whiz over his head, and they found him. The next, later that night, the Minnesotans came back down the hill. They were looking for their dead and wounded, and they found Colvill laying in the gully, and they brought him back up. The next day, they brought him into the hospital, and the doctor says, "Prepare yourself for amputation." And Colvill said, if my foot goes, I go too. He wouldn't let him do it. So they brought him down to a stream not too far away, and they just dangled his foot in the stream all day long. And I think the cold water probably helped the pain and cleaned up his wound. And then he spent about a month in Gettysburg. A family took him in, and two of his men from his company from the First Minnesota tended him, and his sister showed up and took over him and was watching over him too. So he survived, but he was in just constant pain. They tried to bring him back to Minnesota, and they couldn't do. He was in too much pain. So they brought him back to Forestville, and he stayed there a couple of months. In 18, I have to catch up here. On February 6, 1864, they were mustering out the First Minnesota, and the First Minnesota was a well-known regiment, the heroes of Gettysburg. They were the first regiment that had been tendered to the Union at the beginning of the war. They're a pretty famous regiment. So when they were mustered out, it was a big deal in Washington. And the Vice President was there, Secretary of War Stanton was there, all kinds of congressmen and senators and other bigwigs. And in the middle of the banquet, nobody knew this was going to happen. Two of the biggest guys, and they had to be big guys, came and carried Colvill into the room. And I'll just James Wright, who wrote a history of the First Minnesota, said, "His entrance into the banquet hall was unexpected. There was a spontaneous outburst of shouting and cheering, which showed the feelings of the men towards him." He came back to Minnesota. This picture hangs over in the Attorney General's office at the Capitol. He was elected Attorney General. He then immediately ran for the state legislature and was elected to state legislature. And so, but then he was offered the command of the First Minnesota Heavy Artillery something, and he took it. And so he went back to Chattanooga, and he held that job for a while. They breveted him up to general at that point. But if anybody ever called him general for the rest of his life, he said, "No, just call me Colonel Bill." You know, that was his. So he wouldn't take that general stuff. But anyway, he finally got out in July of 1865. He mustered out, and late that year he decided to, he's kind of on a roll. He'd been elected Attorney General. He'd been elected to the legislature. He decided to run for Congress, and he ran against Ignatius Donnelly, who was a very famous, early Minnesotan, and Donnelly was a Republican, and Colvill had kind of flirted with the Republican Party a little bit, but he was back to being a Democrat, and there was no chance. Democrats didn't win any elections for about 30 years, so he lost. He went back. He practiced law in Red Wing. You can kind of get an idea how big he is from this picture. He practiced law in Red Wing. He had a big staff, and he would have to, it was hard for him to get around. He was in pain basically all the time. He married, didn't have any children, but they said at this time, one of his neighbors said you could tell when he was coming down the street because there would be a crowd of children and barking dogs around him all the time. And he was just, he loved children, and he was generous to a fault. And they asked him for money, he'd just reach in his pocket and say, "Take what you want." And he, just for an example of what his responsibility towards money was, when he got married, his wife actually had a prenuptial agreement that put her money in a safe spot so he couldn't get at it. So he hung around long enough, waiting for the Democrats to get back into power. He actually did go in the legislature one more time, but I think he had a tough time getting around, and so he retired after that. In 1889, the Democrats finally did come into power. Grover Cleveland appointed him to a federal job up in Duluth, and so he moved to Duluth. He lived there for a few years. His wife died there in 1895. And so he quit, he retired, and he went and lived most of the year in Grand Marais. He actually, at age 65, he went to homestead, and you have to live on the land if you homestead. So he was homesteading up in Grand Marais, beautiful spot overlooking Lake Superior. And but in the end, he got too old to hang on to that. He moved back to Red Wing and kind of lived out his life as a war hero. But he was broke all the time. He died in debt, and he just never could manage his money. Even I'm sure he made a lot in his lifetime. I'll just show you some photos or pictures of him as this is a bust of him that's in the Goodhue County Museum. So he got old, like we all do, and this is in 1905. He came up. They were going to move they were switching capitals. They had the old Capitol in St. Paul. They were moving up to the one that we see there now that Brian runs over there, and he came up for this ceremony. They're going to move these flags, and he would never miss a chance to have a reunion with his comrades, with his troops, and this picture actually may have been taken. There's no date on this picture, but it was certainly one of the later reunions he went to. And that night he died at the Old Soldiers Home in Minneapolis, which is now the Minneapolis Veterans Home. And he was the first person to lie in state at the Capitol, right outside the governor's office, and thousands of people trooped by. 1909, they dedicated his grave, and he was buried in Cannon Falls, and that's another story. It's probably because where his wife had been buried, but Red Wing was very unhappy, that he wasn't buried there. But the speaker at this dedication was to be James J. Hill, and somehow Hill didn't show up. They said he was called away. And I can't. That's. I've never liked James J. Hill ever since that. But he wrote, his words live on. Hill's words live on. It was delivered by somebody else. He said, "The patriot whose name this memorial bears was one of those direct and simple men who rise so often to the level of great acts." 1929, they rededicated his burial spot in Cannon Falls on top of a hill. They built a thing. It's kind of a nice little thing if you want to go there. They try to keep it up, but it's sometimes not. And the person who did the dedication speech was Calvin Coolidge. And I only bring this up, that he still by that time had such a reputation that the President of the United States dedicated his memorial. But today, very few people have. Highway 19 in southern Minnesota used to be Colvill Memorial Highway. There are no more signs there anymore. It's just kind of faded away. Just like the Metrodome used to be called Hubert Humphrey Metrodome, and now it's Mall of America or something like that. So anyway, but people fade. Their histories fade away, and so I just hope and maybe events like this we can kind of keep his memory alive, and probably one of our most famous Minnesotans. Thanks very much.